one of the bigger issues with pronouns and stuff and all these things is, for one, there's no logical consistency to teach. You end up with these viral videos of this young woman on TikTok with, hundreds of thousands of views saying frog and frog self. And it seems to just be
for this already.
and the people on the left will argue that, well, it's people exploring their self-expression. And it's just like, well, there's no logic. There's a flag for everything. All you're basically telling kids is nothing. You're telling them chaos, static, noise, no definitive understanding of what's going on. Perhaps an adult could understand enough about reality to explore various ideas around how do you categorize. But to go to a child and say an infinite number of categories, every day they're learning something that was just made up yesterday, they're going to have no framework for what's going on.
Well,
but sorry, just please, no. To address the harming themselves. With the laws being passed in California, Washington, and a bunch of these other states that protect third parties who would bring a child for gender reassignment or medical intervention, we're now entering the territory where a 10-year-old kid who has no understanding of what's going on is told by an adult, and this has happened to personal friends of mine twice, and that seems like a heck of a lot for me. Two people that I know had their daughters come home with the teachers telling them that they were trans or lesbian, and they were not. They were 10. And when the parents explained to them, okay, let me ask you, you think you're this, do you know what this means? And the kids go, what? No. Now, what happens if you're in California and the parents are more susceptible to whatever you say, honey? Next thing you know, these kids who have no idea what Lupron is or what it means to get puberty blockers is on a fast track for this, which has resulted in 50,000 people on Reddit joining the D-trans community and an endless slew of posts of people threatening suicide. What I see in the data, and so if you look at the desistance rates, what is it? The number I believe is like 68 to 95% of children who identify as transgender will desist. That doesn't mean detransition. It means that if left to go through their natural puberty, they end up identifying with their biological sex. Typically, they end up being either autistic or gay. What happens now is they will just affirm whatever it is the kid is saying, despite the fact the majority of these kids would self-identify if they're allowed to go through puberty. My concern here is you bring in young kids who don't understand what they're hearing. You layer on books and ideas and things that are more confusing to a child than anything. You layer on the social factor of Instagram, likes, views, etc. And you end up with all of these stories of these prominent, now famous detransitioners saying, I didn't understand. More horrifyingly, you end up with these stories on D-Trans Reddit, where we read one last night where a 17-year-old was threatening suicide because she felt manipulated into getting a double mastectomy, testosterone, and it ruined her life. And now she feels like she can't lead a normal life. Well, yeah. You have these laws being passed that would protect a third party. A third party can take someone's child to the state, dramatically alter their life, cause irreversible changes and or harm, and be legally protected because these kids are not equipped to understand what they're signing up for. My last point on this is, if desistance rates truly are between 60 and 95%, and suicide rates are around 40 to 50%, the smartest and most logical thing we can do, considering the majority of these kids will identify with their biological sex, not be trans, and thus experience lower rates of suicide, is not to intervene at all in any medical way for a child who's experiencing gender dysphoria until after puberty. If we're looking at it from a simple probabilistic standpoint, let's just say it's the lowest number, 60%. Okay. You have a greater than chance probability your child will just self-identify with their biological sex and thus not experience a 50-50 suicide rate. It seems like the math is fairly obvious. You transition your kid, you are boosting their suicide rate to 47%.
Well, and I was going to say, for my part, I have two friends who they had CPS called on them. If you didn't seem like you were immediately affirming, CPS was called on them. And then this is what I'm noticing, just overall, is that the California legislature and other places, in my opinion, are chipping away at parental responsibilities. Traditional parental responsibilities. And this area is one. But in the midst of this, we do have a growing number, little by little here of young people who are detransitioning. But the thing I'm concerned about is that there is this messaging of celebrate, celebrate, celebrate towards those who are making these decisions. But the detransitioners are often humiliated, silenced, and shamed. And to me, that is indicative of part, and I don't think everybody believes that. I think there's a lot of people that don't, but I think the way in which I have seen detransitioners treated, it's so sad.
See, I don't actually agree with this. However, I do 100% understand where you're coming from, and I see that logic, and I understand your mathematical model, and that statistically, I understand your point of view, and I get that. However, I'm gonna make a comparison, and again, because I just love getting people to hate me. That's just like my job, right? It's like, do you remember, kind of like pre-2020, where like the classic news was Black individuals are targeted by the police and it never makes it on the news, and that was the news story. Like the news story itself was Black people are never on the news. That to me is the same situation where it's like, the current news story is detransitioners are never on the news, which inherently puts them on the news, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I understand your perspective, but I've heard it so many times by the same groups of people. Like, well, we never pay attention to detransitioners because that amount is like infinitesimally small. And actually, we do hear about it all the freaking time. You just are, it's always in the context of, we never hear about detransitioners. Yes, we do. It's literally on like, it's like on every YouTube channel and podcast. Right. I hear it consistently. And then like that other side note though, of that idea of like, well, it's always like celebrate, celebrate, celebrate. Just an idea, just an idea. That idea of, yes, parents, you guys, you know your kids and you know them extremely well, right? However, if you don't celebrate a kid's exploration into different topics, they sometimes start pushing back without even knowing what they're pushing back against. And that's actually what I'm more worried about. That idea of, and of course I can't speak on like specific clients, right? But like I can say I've had multiple instances where a parent has, come to me and being like, oh, well, she wants to be called he now. What do I do? And I gotta say, I say the exact opposite thing of kind of what you're going for, is I say like, go with it. Because when you start pushing against it, they start pushing back on the parent without even knowing what they're pushing back on. And I've had plenty of students, and this is nothing against the trans community, because I'm such, like, obviously, right? But I've had plenty of students who, they are gender queer and whatever, and their pronouns say whatever. And I've also had plenty of students where they said, oh yeah, I'm definitely trans. And we were like, oh, cool, okay, they, them, he, him, she, her, whatever. And you went with it for a couple months. And then they realized, after just leaving it with just going with it, they're like, actually, that's not a thing.
This is why parents don't want it in schools.
But like, okay. But again, like, how big is the problem? It's just, I don't see it as a fundamental issue, right? I see, of course, any teacher going outside of their realm of expertise as an issue. Right? I am a learning specialist with a master's of science in education with a focus in language processing disorders. I'm not an endocrinologist. I can't say you should take this hormone. That's out of my scope. I can't say that. That's not allowed, or it shouldn't be. Right? But also that idea of like, is it really that bad if like, oh, okay, you go by she, they, and then I call my student they, and everyone on TikTok, I can't believe you call students they, them, you're indoctrinating. No, like, they literally asked me to call them they, them. Like, it's just, I don't know if this indoctrination thing is real. I do understand the statistical analysis that you gave, though. I'd love to hear more about that.
I'd say it is.
Okay.
With books like Genderqueer and This Book is Gay being in schools, and there's a substantially, it's more than just these two books we have in front of us. And then, of course, critical race theory was the big debate a couple of years ago, because it seems like critical theory in general was being brought into schools in a variety of ways. So it is indoctrination.
Okay.
My response to most people is like, we want indoctrination. We just don't want that indoctrination. We want to teach the positive values of our moral frameworks, innocent until proven guilty, et cetera. Those are big components, the rights of the individual, meritocracy. And now we have children being taught an inversion of this. And we have, in many circumstances, the severing of the family unit in terms of don't tell your parents. Okay. The response from liberals is they're trying to force schools to out the children to their parents. Well, you have no right. If a child is experiencing anything, be it bulimia or some kind of gender confusion, it is not the state's obligation nor right to intervene in that regard. But that is what's happening.
Well, and I want to say something to that, because For a couple things with regards to schools. I mean, we had a situation where a volunteer at a school had threatened our oldest when he was young. And I noticed some change in him after school. And I was never told about this. So I actually approached the school staff, and then that's when I learned of the situation. There was another situation with our youngest in school where there were threats from other students. And so one of the times I went to the school board meeting is our youngest had multiple threats from a student, really descriptive, graphic threats. And what happened was I had been getting those notices about, your child's been exposed to lice, your child's been exposed to strep throat, but I was never notified when our littlest had these very scary experiences at school.
Liability issues.
Yeah, it's very concerning.
But
and so,
nonetheless, a false equivalent. Like they're not the same thing, right? Like that idea of like, this is what I'm like constantly trying to get on, which is that idea of like, they're not the same thing. Like your child being threatened, you need to tell the parent. Your child is injured, you need to fill out an accident report. That actually is usually mandated, but it's like different if it's like, oh, so-and-so said they want to go by they, them. Would I tell the parent? 1,000%, right? But is it is it mandated? Like, is it, hear me out. Okay. And this is like very tricky. If a student ever comes to me and they're like, I go by they, them, but my mom doesn't know, or my dad doesn't know, my first thought is there's something that needs to be repaired within family communication. It's not, I gotta hide this kid's gender identity from the parent. It's the idea of we need to create some type of environment where this conversation needs to happen. Because if I immediately, and I'm not saying this is even the case, right? But if a teacher immediately, like you said, like outs a kid, right? That could create a problematic situation. In fact, it could be creating in a situation where it's indoctrination to be straight and cisgendered, right? Which is actually much more indoctrinating. It's usually that way, right? Like on average, most Disney movies, despite like new recent developments, most Disney movies kind of perpetuate the kind of what we consider the fancy word is like heteronormative, right? Heteronormative cisgendered ideologies. And do we need to kind of perpetuate that as the norm? I love that idea of like, we want to indoctrinate innocent until proven guilty. But does that translate to straight until proven gay? Like those are two very different things in my opinion.
Well, don't do any of it.
Yeah. And I think, sorry.
No,
I was going to say, I think for my part, it is a fair comparison only in the sense of parents are being notified less and less of all kinds of things.
Okay, fair.
And I think too, I just want to the point earlier with regards to, the stories in the news, it's not so much the news stories, it's the organizations that promote certain things. I don't see any of those organizations supporting detransitioners. And I think that to me starts to make me question what's going on. Why is it they only celebrate, but those who experience regret feel like they're oftentimes alone. And I feel like everyone should be able to get behind those people because I think they need love and support.
I have no issue.
Well, I think we agree on that.